Let me just get out of here. Okay, so our presenter today is David Gaudet. David is a colleague. I met David a couple of years ago in a conference. He's based in Calgary, Canada, so north of us over here. David has, had multiple experience. I guess when I was looking at his bio, from being an entrepreneur to now in the academic side. And one of the things that David has also done a lot of work is in the area of curiosity. And he's recently published a book that I'm just going over right now. It's called The Daily Undoing. And he sent me a copy of this book a couple of weeks ago. So I have been going over this. And what I thought this morning would be, his presentation would be a little bit different, I think, than our normal presentation with our local entrepreneurs. I think his presentation is going to make us think, and I think you really are going to enjoy what he has got to present and share with us. So David, without further ado here, the stage is yours. Then after you're done, then we will get into the discussion and the Q&A part of the presentation.
Fantastic. Well, I can't thank you enough, Raja, for inviting me into this world. It was completely foreign to me until you mentioned it, I think, when we first started to reconnect about a month ago. And what a fabulous idea. I am familiar with the Kauffman Foundation through the NACI organization, which is, I think, the forum in which you and I met, which is all about community colleges rallying together for entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship training. So Raja and I have become kind of kindred spirits and have always looked forward to running into one another at these things up until the last couple of years when no one was running into anybody. But it's been great to reconnect with you, Raja, and very grateful to have been brought into this world of 1 million cups. I think it's a fantastic initiative. And, I am a bit of a foreigner. It looks like it's only a US initiative, but I'm going to have to try and figure out how to get a Canadian version of it going. So yes, I'm from Calgary, Canada, which is way, way, way over to the west side of the country. We're closer to Vancouver than we are to Toronto, and closer to the beautiful National Park of Banff, which to many of you might be more familiar than Calgary itself. It's a pristine part of the world with beautiful snow-capped mountains throughout the year. Which produce beautiful little creeks, streams, waterfalls in the summertime, which we're about to go through. So I see some people are already, I said we're about to go through, not you and me. My family and I are about to drive through them as part of our summer getaway. We're going to be driving to this place behind me, which is on the west coast. It's called Vancouver Island, which is a short ferry ride from the mainland over to one of the many islands in that Juan de Fuca Strait. So someone has already participated. They grabbed that code at the top of the screen here. If you have downloaded the Mentimeter app on your phone, you'll be prompted for a code. That is it at the top, 79675545. And you just plop that in where it says enter code here. And this is just sort of a warm-up activity to kind of, first of all, for me, ensure that it's working, that we're all connected. Menti is a Swedish company that continues to add different apps and different functionality to their online platform. And this place a pin where you live function is brand new. I've never tried it before. And but I was using it on my phone. I don't live anywhere near here, so I couldn't drag a pin to where I live. But I would like to get a sense as to where you are specifically. I just grabbed a Google Maps screenshot and put it into the middle of the slide here. And you should be able to just drag your mouse around and kind of drop it approximately where you live. Now, I was in Philadelphia 2 years ago, almost to the day, hence the hat. I went and attended a Phillies game. I was speaking at the International Society for Technology and Education conference, which is kind of the biggest ed tech conference, I think, in the world. And visited Philly for the first time since I was a kid. And never really got out into the countryside of Pennsylvania. Strangely enough, after Raja and I started to talk, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of selective perception. As soon as you sort of get some word or name or even a brand inside of your head and you start to focus on it, suddenly that thing seems to appear everywhere. So after I'd heard of Lehigh Valley, twice in a row within a week, that place showed up in completely different random searches. And one of it was in a book that I was reading at the time called Radical Curiosity, which I strongly recommend, by Kenny Dykewald. And the other one was in the New York Times, which has recently published a couple of articles about burgeoning new industries popping up in your area. So I'm now totally entranced with this whole concept of Lehigh Valley. It sounds and looks like a beautiful place. I own a couple of Martin guitars, so I'm quite familiar with the guitar factory nearby. We have a Fender factory near here in Calgary, just over the border in Montana, but I prefer the Martin guitars, so I'm partial to Pennsylvanians in that way as well. But I see a few dots showing up here. I think looks like we got 6 people placing a dot on the map so far. I'm not going to wait too long for this one. I just was kind of curious to see how it worked. If you do have that Mentimeter app on your phone and you want to kind of put a needle where your area of residence is, that would be great. It looks like the concentration is right in this center of the screen. Looks like a little bit east of Allentown. I know there's a Billy Joel song called Allentown as well, isn't there? All right. You'll be playing with the Mentimeter lots throughout this short presentation today, so I'll give you many more chances to work with that. So today's presentation is kind of based on the subtitle of my book. The book is called The Daily Undoing, with the subtitle Being Better at Being Human. But my research and what I'm hoping to convince to you today is that concept of being better at being human is not just the exclusive domain of the general public. It permeates all specific niches of humanity as well. Being a better teacher, being a better parent, being a better student, being a better friend, being a better professional, and of course, being a better entrepreneur as well. These 8 hacks that I'm going to tell you about are represented by what I call the 8 pillar competencies, which really became the most important part of the book. And before we get started here with what I think are the most important parts of being an entrepreneur, being a better human, I wanted to hear from you. So we're going to build a little word cloud here together to get started today, and ask you what the most vital personality trait you think is required to being a successful entrepreneur. And then I'll get into mine as well. So I think you've got like 3 different choices there that you can type in your responses, and we should start to form a little word cloud here based on everyone's responses. I'm going to be a good little soldier and play along myself with my Mentimeter app. And I will say, all right, so thank you for playing along. As you can see, what happens instantaneously here is the formation of popular opinion based on our little group, which I believe is a total of 19, I think Raja said. And I'm delighted at the early results coming in. I feel like a pollster here, but I love to see that curiosity is sort of was, at least in the lead, showing a bit of a dominant presence. But as we're seeing here, there are lots of different words that we associate with being a successful entrepreneur. And I can't disagree with any of them. I mean, they all pretty much speak your language, don't they? Having goals, being open, being flexible, being comfortable with risk, being curious and inquisitive, being flexible. Wow, man, have we ever had to be that over the past 16 months? And still feeling optimistic as well. So all of these are, of course, very fitting responses to qualities, personality qualities that we expect to have for successful entrepreneurship. As Raja pointed out, I decided to go deep into this whole concept of personality traits as they applied to kind of my primary stakeholders outside of my family. As I'm a post-secondary instructor at Southern Alberta Institute of Technology here in Calgary. It's a campus with about 8,000 full-time students when we are on campus. And the book was kind of written with them in mind, because I began to notice after 20 years of teaching, and I've also been an entrepreneur for 30 years, that there was a real missing. And I didn't know where it began, but what I identified was 8, what I call these pillar competencies that these students weren't going on into the workforce with. And no one was training them. It wasn't happening at home. It wasn't happening in primary, secondary, or post-secondary. It was just sort of assumed that all of these things would click into action when required. And in 2020, I decided that I was going to go in. I'd already been doing a daily podcast for about a year and a half. And in 2020, I decided to get uber focused on this concept of competencies. And I was going to do a daily podcast focusing on one of these 8 different pillar competencies every day. The plan was always to do a workbook as a companion piece to that, and that followed earlier on this year. So I basically took all of the scripts from those podcasts and I whittled them down into little bite-sized chunks, which contained both a little insight into one of the competencies and an action tip for each one. And so that's the book, the podcast, and I'm working on some courses to go along with this as well. What I found, not only in doing this, but it was one of the provocations for doing this project, to build this ecosystem of competency-based learning, was, again, knowing that my students were being shoved out the pipeline into the work world and they were underprepared. I was feeling a bit guilty. In fact, I blogged about this not that long ago. I was saying, I've kind of had enough of being a part of the problem. I want to start being a part of the solution. And I realized, I think probably most emphatically when I started to work and interview employers, not only in my hometown of Calgary, but across Canada and even in the US as well, about what incoming students were lacking. And time again, and it continues to this day and until things change, is that students were underprepared in these competencies. And they're often referred to as skills or soft skills or transferable skills. I'm going to tell you why I feel that they're better described and defined as competencies. But nevertheless, students were underprepared, employers were undersatisfied, graduates were underemployed then, because they were going in and I would find my graduates working in Starbucks and brick and mortar retail shops, which of course is fine, but that's not what they were trained to do. And I began to identify what I called the real skills gap. And it's certainly something that has been talked about in North America and around the world, is this thing called the skills gap. And it's not just about how we are under-equipped technologically, and we need to be all AI professionals, but before the end of the year. It goes right back to the very roots and the DNA of our chemical makeup and how we behave as human beings. That's what I identified the real skills gap to be. So combined with the research that I did and my own teaching experience, I went deeper into what I called the problem to pinpoint these areas, these gaps in behaviors. And what I discovered is that everybody, of course, possesses these traits or these competencies, but we just assume that they're going to snap into action whenever we need them to, kind of like a light switch or a water tap, and they don't. And about 5 of these competencies were highlighted by the focus groups that I did across Canada. They're supported by OECD, by just about any level of government. The United States has something called 21st Century Skills and Future Skills Movement, Competency-Based Education Network. They all concur with about 5 of these, those being critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity, or design thinking. But I decided and problem solving, but I decided that curiosity, character, and citizenship were pretty important as well. So I gained support of those competencies and put them into my little schematic here as well. So in short, I mean, they're pretty self-explanatory, but here's kind of my rationale for identifying and really focusing on this. And remember, I did podcast episodes on each of these in sort of a rotating basis throughout the entire year, the 366 days of 2020. And then they're all represented as a page in my book. And so I had to come up with essentially about 45 different versions or variations of each of these different competencies. And I did that using action words, which I'll get to on my next slide. But I wanted to just spend a little bit of time going over, what these competencies are and why they're important. I call curiosity the gateway drug to competency-based learning, competency-based living. And I think that, and in fact, it showed up on our Mentimeter poll a minute ago. A lot of people would concur. Even some of the other synonyms for curiosity that you included in the word cloud, things like inquisitiveness and questioning and always being curious, are part of this. I just find if we're not curious, the others don't have a chance. We can't possibly communicate effectively or collaborate effectively. We certainly can't problem solve or create or even critically think if we're not curious in the first place. And it's sadly something that we lose. We've got a greater propensity to be curious when we're young than as we grow up. We tend to be more motivated by self-gain when we grow up than by pure epistemic curiosity. So I feel that we need to exercise our curiosity muscle more often. The power of choice competency is our character competency. And I borrow a couple of books to kind of demonstrate this. One of them is Angela Duckworth's Grit, which is all about being resilient and powering through when everyone else says you're going to fail. So there's a kind of a dual meaning of character here. One is that grit, and the other one is the power of choice, that ultimately you get to make the choice of your own decisions. You get to make the choice of how you react to adversity. You get to make the choice as to how you react to perhaps immediate success that falters after a while. Character is a really important competency, and it also is our moral compass as well. The problem-solving curiosity, as I call the figure it out competency, is about dealing with complex problems. And as entrepreneurs, we're faced with these all the time. Certainly the pandemic era gave us more than our share of complex problem solving, from everything from supply chain to delivery systems to distribution. Just staying alive was about as complex as problems can be. So that ranks as one of the top problem solving, or one of the top competencies as well. Collaboration, I call the do well with others competency. So it's not just enough to play well with others and to get along. You also have to contribute not only your key areas of expertise, but you have to be a cheerleader. You have to be someone who motivates and helps others as well. Simply chiming in with your own skill set and leaving is not really being collaborative. The communication competency is the speaking and listening competency. Of course, as entrepreneurs and business leaders yourselves, you know that the kind of the underappreciated component of communication is the listening component of it. We spend a lot of time trying to get our ideas across with words and voices, but we don't spend enough time on the most important part of communication, which is the listening competency. So that's why I call it the speaking and listening competency. Citizenship is the for people and planet competency. There's been a lot of talk about this competency, and I've really blogged a lot about it recently in the past few weeks, stemming from some of the things that we've recognized here in Canada as to how we treated our Indigenous people over the last couple of centuries. It's all coming to kind of a very ugly realization over these past couple of weeks. And the news might have even hit Pennsylvania as well, of a residential school system and the Truth and Reconciliation Act, which we're still coming to grips with. And so I've actually done a lot of soul searching on this one myself, this citizenship competency, and try to figure out ways that I can be a better global citizen. The other part of this is being a better planetary citizen as well. So, being more sustainable with our practices, both in business and in our daily lives as well. The creativity competency is the willing to fail competency. So this is, you'll notice that most of these, all but one, in fact, begin with the letter C, and that's pure coincidence. But once I got on a roll, I was thinking, should I call this design thinking or should I call it creativity? And I call it creativity not only because it began with the letter C, but because I just think that creativity is a much more plain language interpretation of design thinking. But at its core, that's really what I mean by this competency. You have to be willing to fail. You want to be an experimenter, an innovator. You want to be trying new things when others say it's impossible. And in fact, you never really appreciate or understand or go along with the word no. And finally, as we make our way around the clock here, this little pizza is the critical thinking, the open-minded always competency. And again, there's 40 or 45 different lessons in my book on each of these things. And the critical thinking competency, I kept coming back to defeating prejudices and biases in our minds in order to really get to the truth. Now, all of these competencies are, as I said, they're well supported and documented and researched as being whatever you want to call them, 21st century skills, future skills, OECD core competencies. They're all sort of on those lists, with the exception of curiosity and citizenship and character, which I added in myself. I'm curious now about what your thoughts are. Looks like my headline got cut off here, but I wanted to know what you think your sharpest competency is. I'm actually running an ad campaign now on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where I'm asking people to come to an ad to take a quiz, asking them what they think their sharpest competency is, and they go through a series of questions. Now it pops this result. I'm going to give you a link to that at the end of the presentation to see if the way you take the quiz.
Tell me how I remember you.
I'm sorry?
Oh, that Jen. Okay, I remember. You know what? You
Well, somebody's mic
I
is,
remember that. I was like,
just a second, David, somebody's mic is, let me mute there. Okay, go ahead.
I thought someone was asking a question, which is always fine, by the way. I'm pretty informal here. So based on the 8 competencies that I just rolled out for you, I'm curious what you think your sharpest competency is. So, we're, as entrepreneurs and as community and business leaders, you're probably peaking in multiple, and I think entrepreneurs actually peak in multiple competencies among these 8. But my contention is that we're kind of born, and 1 or 2 of these things come supernaturally to us. And so we use them over and over and over. They're sort of our comfort competency. And I'm curious to know from you what you consider to be your sharpest competency. So of these 8, curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, citizenship, now my graph here is popped in and out of order because you're participating in the activity here. But tell me what you think is your most powerful, your sharpest competency. And I love the fact that problem solving is jumping into the lead. Character, number 2, you can see for yourselves how this is sort of playing itself out. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to complete that. Again, using your Mentimeter app. If you're just joining us, you're trying to figure out what this is, I'm using something that you can get from your Google App Store or your Apple App Store. It's called Mentimeter. And as soon as you download it, you'll be asked to put in a code. The code is at the top of the page, and you can participate in these activities. It looks like most people have probably participated, those who are going to participate. And so this is really telling us that, at least in this group, you consider that problem solving is probably your strongest or your sharpest competency of the 8 that I shared. I am going to be running this same activity this afternoon, speaking to my faculty at the college that I teach at, and I'm likely going to get a completely different assortment. The key is that we all have what we consider to be our strongest competencies. But the other side of the coin is that we would look at what we don't think we're doing very well at, and perhaps consciously make an effort to brush up on those competencies. Again, we possess all 8 and others. This is not a finite or exhaustive list, but we possess a number of these human behaviors that we need to thrive as human beings, as teachers, as parents, as family members, and of course, as entrepreneurs. So if we're really, really strong in one, we're going to use that a lot. But the aha is here to go and awaken the other ones and try to engage those as well. And the book, as I said, provides hundreds of different ideas on how to do that. So for instance, this next slide here kind of shows you just a sample of activities that I have in the book to help exercise these different competencies. So the solution to the problem of competency shortages or competency unawareness was to create a competency training book in which people would be constantly reminded of these 8 pillar competencies and be provided with a different action word to practice them each day. So for example, the curiosity competency would be accompanied by a page that had the suggestion to zag. So when everyone is going one way, try going the other, which would be, of course, a way to demonstrate curiosity. It would be a way not to follow the crowd, to do something different. A character activity would be to dare to do something, to coach yourself through something that feels uncomfortable. Speaking in front of people, providing an idea that you think is going to get dismissed or negated simply because it sounds outlandish, doing something that is going to push you into a discomfortable zone. A problem-solving competency, I go into a lot of depth into the book about different ways to unpack the problem-solving process, and spending a lot of time at the beginning of the problem-solving process diagnosing the problem. So rather than dealing with what you see to be the problem at the stage that it is now, is to trace it back to its origin and find out where it started. Collaboration example would be to mentor someone, to provide knowledge to someone in your team who needs it. So again, rather than just coming and performing a set of tasks and leaving, take a look around people that you're participating with and see where there's ways that you can help mentor someone into performing their tasks better. Communication example would be to resonate, to really spend time on your communication, be they written or spoken, and do a little research to find buzzwords, words that really touch nerves among your audience, and use those in your communications. That would be resonating with your audience through your communication. A citizenship example would be to reuse. There's a couple of exercises in the book that say, go to your recycling bin or even your garbage can and find something that you've thrown away mindlessly and find a way to get one more use out of it. So whether it be an old plastic container from something that you purchased with food, or whether it be an old pair of clothing, find a way to use these things again before it hits the landfill would be an example of a citizenship exercise. Creativity, as I said before, being comfortable with failure would be an example of how you can practice creativity. So literally take an example of when you failed with something, write down a learning that occurred from it, because all failure usually ends up with something that you learned and then can reuse in the future. And then finally, critical thinking, an example here of how to practice your critical thinking competency would be to closely examine possible outcomes of a decision, because critical thinking and problem solving are sort of attached here. You're always trying to come up with a decision at the end, but rendering a fair and objective decision means closely examining not only the evidence that you're dealing with, but also the possible outcomes of each. So again, in my book, there's a total of 366 similar versions of these. And to come up with this master list, I actually built a spreadsheet. And as you can see along the top, I built eight columns representing each competency. And throughout the year, I would add action words underneath each one of those. And then I'd do a podcast on each of these episodes, which of course then ended up into the book. So there's not really any purpose in showing you this other than my process in going about making a podcast and ultimately a book that I'm sharing with you today. So like any entrepreneur, I decided early that I needed to establish target markets. My podcast, I wasn't too worried about because it was something I was going to do anyway. But when it came time to actually selling a book, I needed to really dive down into who this was targeted at. And as a marketing teacher, I found myself contradicting a lot of my own theory. I mean, in marketing, we teach students, and I even consult in marketing, and I teach my clients to focus on a target market, as in individual. But ultimately, as I'm sure you know, that we start these businesses maybe thinking of one market, but eventually growing into multiple or several. And that's what happened to me. The podcast was written through the lens of a way of helping students and entrepreneurs gain some attention and awareness around these competencies. But as I've released the book, what I've found is that there's a market not only for entrepreneurs and graduates and soon to be graduates or recent graduates, but there's a market for B2B as well. So I'm going after educational institutions and for-profit and not-for-profit organizations as well, selling the book so that HR departments can use them. And it's already been picked up by a couple of organizations in the US and at least 2 colleges here in Canada as a means of, again, not only teaching these competencies, but making people aware of why they're important. So those are my target markets for the book. And some of the feedback that I've received from the book so far, you can see I've had people participate and actively share some of their participation in social media. Over on the left here is an actual photograph of someone who was working through the book and came to a character page. And this is a picture of the book. So this is someone using the book and an example of how it's structured. So the competency on that particular page is all about character. I'm quoting Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and then I'm challenging whoever's reading it to go and find a Viktor Frankl quote that really resonates with them. And so this person posted this picture and said, "This book is a practical and involved way to explore ourselves through insightful nudging. using what's outlined as pillar competencies. What I adore about this book is that it requires you to actively participate. I took the kind of the easy way out here. I wrote half a book. I even say that in the prologue that I just wrote the outline, and it's up to whoever reads it to kind of write their own story. I was just on a podcast last week with a fellow entrepreneur here in Calgary who's got an enormous following. So it was a big boon for me to get on the Canadian podcast with my friend Zach here. So he actually challenged me, kind of as I did you, as to what he thought my pillar competency was, what my sharpest one was. And then, as you know, also as entrepreneurs, you're not going to get something unless you actually ask for it. And so what I found, and I've known this from a lot of podcasts that I listen to as well, you have to ask for reviews in order to get reviews. And so this review that you see here came with some encouragement from me. This review comes from a student, actually, I think, who bought the book and decided to post a review on it. I, of course, didn't tell him what to say, but I said, look, if you like it, then please make a review on it, because that's going to help other people discover it. And if you're a podcast listener, as I'm sure many of you are, this is why podcasters, even the most prolific of them all, are constantly reminding us to leave reviews for their podcast at the end. And I think that's a communication competency tool, to ask if you really want to receive. Now, the final part of the framework that I wanted to show you is what's on, as you might have seen back here. You see this on every page, this Venn diagram. And that's sort of the framework of the whole competency-based learning system, which asserts that in order to become competent or to improve our competencies, we've got these three different layers or three different bubbles that we need to think about, be conscious of. We first need to have an attitude for learning, an open-mindedness and a willingness to learn. That's the attitude bubble. We then need to gain knowledge about that learning. So we need to dive in and do the reading or do the interviewing or do the thinking to actually absorb the knowledge. And ultimately, the best demonstration of our competence is our ability to show it in the form of a skill. So this AKS model, again, with several variations out there in publication, is pretty key to this whole concept of competency-based learning as well. I think my next slide here, oh no, I'm coming up to it in a second. This is also an excerpt from the book. This shows a blank work page. The next page that I have in my book is explaining how you would use it if you were to follow the process as I explained it. So you can actually listen to the podcast as well. So I've got each of the pages numbered by episode as well. So you can subscribe to the podcast and go back and reference them by episode number. You can listen to the podcast to get a little deeper context. You can then read the theory here, and then you can go through the process of the action, starting with setting an attitude, seeking to know, and then practicing the skills. So there's an example here of how I would encourage or instruct someone to use the book. And then I've got sort of an example of how most people will use the book, which is basically as a doodle palette. Sure, there's going to be some interaction and some following of the instructions, but ultimately it should be just this open blank canvas to go about reflection and becoming more self-aware. So yeah, this is the next participative act that I wanted to do with you. So I've kind of laid out the framework of competencies being made of attitude, knowledge, and skill. And I'm looking for your input here. And a lot of what I'm going to gather from you is good market research from me as well. So do you think attitude is the most important part of a competency? Knowledge is the most important part of a competency? Skill is the most important part of a competency? Or a combination of all three are equally important components of a competency? So again, I'll seek your input here quickly, and right away we've got lots of people jumping into the activity here. And it looks like we've got most people strongly agreeing with the knowledge aspect. Interesting, and I know that this is a tiny sample, and you haven't been given a whole lot of background on the framework and might want to read a little bit more about it. But it's interesting just at this very high level that we're seeing the way things are sort of sorting themselves out. Skill kind of being a little underappreciated, at least in terms of our little focus group here, in terms of its importance in this framework of competencies. I find that super interesting. And I would have thought right away that the combination of all three, attitude, knowledge, and skill, would be deemed kind of the most important. If you had to select between one of these four scenarios, which would you select? And it looks like, again, super small sample, but attitude being the most important. And who could really argue with that? All right, so thank you for your participation on that. I am coming to an end here because I do want to get to your questions really quickly. So this is kind of the total framework. You've got your building of a competency here with your attitude, knowledge, and skill then, and you've got your 8 different core competencies, your pillar competencies revolving around the outside. And I believe Rosh has made these slides available to you. What I'm going to do for you, or ask you to do for me rather, is to get you to participate in this activity, but it's not one that you can do on Menti. So I'm going to send you a, I'm going to send you, if I can find it now, the code to do this. I think what I'm going to have to do is stop my sharing here for a second, which is just as well because I'm going to have to go to a different screen anyway.
And David, while you are doing this, why don't I also do this? I'm also going to let the audience, if they have some questions or thoughts that they're thinking about as you are presenting, then they can also share or ask you a question. Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah. So if anyone has any comments, thoughts, questions, feel free to either unmute your mic, raise your hand, whatever is convenient for you. So just let me know.
And I've just shared the link to that last quiz that I would love you to do. Now I'm going to be fully transparent. This is called a lead magnet. So if you choose to do this, you're going to be pulled into the world of Dave's email subscriber list, which is one of my motives in doing it. But the other motive in doing it is this other tool that I use called Interact is a great quiz tool for engagement. And it does get people to think, and it also provides you with some excellent marketing research. So just full disclosure right away, if you do participate in that, in order to get your results, you'll have to just give me your email address. So if you're comfortable with that, I'm glad to see what you're up to in terms of what your actual competency is. If you're not comfortable with that, then don't bother doing that. But I just wanted to let you know. And with that, Raja, I see that I've really gobbled up more time than I anticipated here, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay. Any questions to start with? Any comments? You can just unmute your. Yes, Stacy, go ahead.
Hi, David. I have a question for you about where you feel knowledge of self fits in this system. As an entrepreneur, one of the things that I have found is that going into business, it brings up all of the insecurities, all of the concerns, and I find that having knowledge of self, getting to know myself better, really helps in the success of my business. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks for that question, Stacy. It's a great one. As someone asked me, I think it might have been Zach in that podcast that I was doing, or perhaps someone else. I'm really kind of working the podcast circuit these days and speaking a lot about it. And someone asked me, what is the ultimate outcome that you want people to get from this book? Is it to be more competent in all of these 8 areas? And I have to admit, I sort of stumbled around with that one because I didn't want to use the subtitle of the book because I thought that was cheating. But ultimately, being better at being human was a very intentional subtitle to this book. But the interviewer said, is it really about self-awareness? And I said, bingo. Can I use that? Because that's really what it is. I mean, being better at being human does boil down to being more self-aware. And I think that it's, you could call that kind of the arc over the entire competency framework on all 8 competencies, because when you dive into any of them, whether it's communication or collaboration or character, and the way that the workbook is structured, it challenges you to reflect and to do that homework on yourself. So my thoughts on self-awareness are that, it couldn't be more integral to the whole process and to becoming more competent in all of these areas. I wish I would have put some writing around that in the intro to the book, but you've hit the nail on the head, Stacy. It's really, you're working towards a level of self-awareness that you hadn't, that maybe you hadn't had through this exercise.
As you were speaking, I kept thinking about the illusionist Derek Delgadio. There's a movie out called In It of Itself. If anyone has seen it, I'm sure you'll agree, but if you haven't, you have to see this. This is on Netflix. And basically, it's ultimately getting to see yourself. And I think I agree with Stacy and I agree with you, David. You need to know fundamentally, if you can, who you are before venturing into an entrepreneurship or
Yeah.
whatever.
Oh,
Made a note of that. So that's a movie, Tony?
Yeah, it's called In It of Itself.
In and of itself.
It will move you in ways that you would not believe. And he's an illusionist, and he used to be a gambler. And basically, in the end of it all, which I don't want to say too much about it, it reveals more about you than him.
Yeah, I'm all over
It's
that.
phenomenal. It's
Yeah.
phenomenal.
And I think what you find, whether you're using my platform or anyone else's, is when you start really diving into this, you'll find it cathartic. I make it a point every time that I speak about this. It's mentioned several times in the book. Every time I post about it, and I'll say it in front of you guys as well. I am no one's guru on this. I happen to be a teacher who discovered a problem, even in the way that I was teaching, and decided to do a podcast about it and then make a book about it. And I routinely go back to the things that I wrote about and I say, wait a minute, I call my own bluff on a lot of this. And recently, I've really been focused on this character and citizenship competency pairing. And I'm thinking to myself, how can I claim to be strong in citizenship when I have been alive? I'm almost 60 years old. And this whole residential school project here in Canada, which is a complete abomination of humanity and human rights, and is only now coming to really to the surface. I look at myself and I say, where were you? Like, and it's not as though I knew about it, but I wasn't being curious enough about it. So I wasn't being curious. I wasn't practicing citizenship. And so I find the whole thing very cathartic when you do these activities. Again, whether you're using a formal platform or program, or whether you're just, I think Stacy, you brought it up, really challenging yourself on all of these aspects. I think you find something very cathartic about it, and you can't help but grow as a result.
so can I? I've got a comment on that, Dave. Here, so I was looking at. I think this was the second Mentimeter poll that you just ran. During this presentation, I think you asked all of us, what did we thought? Where were we strong? What our strength was when you're looking at the 8 skill sets. It was pretty interesting. I saw that problem solving came at number 1, but creativity and citizenship was 6 and 8, right? So what does that so what does that tell us? So that's that was pretty interesting to me. So.
Yeah, and me too. And as I said, I'm going to do the same thing this afternoon with my colleagues, and I would not be surprised at all if it's different. Those are teachers and post-secondary staff, and I wish I would have had time to go around to each of the 19 or 20 people here and ask specifically what your job was, what your professional identity is or was. But I'm guessing that it's very different than a post-secondary culture. And so I'm anticipating going to see something different. I think that, again, the takeaway from that isn't that one's better than the other or one's more important and others are less important. I think what you see from a result like that is in amongst this very randomly thrown together, based only on geography group, that there seems to be a tendency towards this problem solving competency, and maybe not as much awareness in creativity and citizenship. And they, honestly, those particular competencies may not be as urgent amongst the group of people here. Otherwise, you might see them ranking a little bit higher.
Other questions or comments?
I'll make a comment on that with the competencies. My understanding of the question when we answered is what did we feel was natural for us? And so not important to us, so which may have changed the outcome. So I'm an entrepreneur now. I was trained as an engineer. Problem solving is absolutely my lane, right? Like that's what engineering's all about, solving problems. Versus citizenship, while it is, like you, Dave, ranking higher and higher, and I'm seeing the value and how it's really been, I feel, underrepresented in terms of importance to all of us, or many of us. You know, it's not something that's comfortable yet. It's not something that feels natural yet, but that doesn't, that's just what feels natural, not what is important. So just a thought on that.
Yeah, no, you're right. The phrasing of the question, the way it was set up, might certainly sway how you answer it. So I agree with that as well, Stacy.
I have a comment,
Rita.
pushback question. I don't know what it is. When I look at when you describe citizenship, you're looking at a much more larger issue in your country or in the history of both of our countries. But I see citizenship more locally also, because if I'm not engaged with the business owners around me, then I'm not going to succeed. So it's my job as a local citizen to help promote and encourage and connect and refer to the business owners around me as a small business owner. And so I look at your citizenship category in a way that if the people around me are doing well, then I'm going to do well too. So that doesn't negate the larger, more global view that you have over our citizenship responsibility and righting the wrongs of our past, but it's still, in my eyes, a citizenship category.
Couldn't agree more. And yeah, you'll find, again, with over 40 different examples for each of these competencies, that I do get into that more localized form of citizenship as well. It's interesting. I was speaking to one of the purchasers of the book. She's from Ohio. I think she lives in Cleveland, but she gets to Pennsylvania quite a bit. She's got family there. And I was talking to her last week, and she had the book and she was working through it. And we were just having this normal conversation. And she goes, "Tell me, what competency does that belong to?" And she caught me off guard. And I said, "What we were just talking about?" And she said, "Yeah, is that communication or collaboration or citizenship?" And I said, "Well, our daily activities don't have to belong to one of them exclusively, right? They permeate and cross-pollinate around all 8 of them. So when you're working on your citizenship, you can't help but be working on your communication as well, and your collaboration. So the point you bring up there, Rita, being a good improving or being more aware of your citizenship duties at a global level is equally important at a local level, is equally important at a board meeting level, right? So it goes up and down and sideways and in reverse and forward all the time. The last slide that I wanted to show you with the framework, I actually have the circle in the background spinning kind of like a flywheel, because that's really how it's meant to be thought of, is that they're constantly in motion, kind of like in orbit.
Why don't we go ahead and take one more question or comment? Anybody else that would like to comment? Okay. David, thank you for joining us, this morning. And I'm going to, pitch your book one more time. Here's Gaudet, and I'm actually going over this right now, because one of the things that I'm looking at is how can this apply, to our students here, of some of the things that they are doing, especially in courses like the entrepreneurial mindset, but especially his workbook. I can tell you that I think it can be very relevant to also practicing entrepreneurs. That can be good as well. And what we'll do is that we'll also go ahead and forward Dave's presentation to others that are not able to join us today, because I think I certainly enjoyed it, and I'm getting a lot of comments here. David is saying that the presentation was great, and that all of us really enjoyed this. So why don't we do this before we move into our networking session? Any announcements? So let's I'll give about 2 or 3 minutes for that. Anybody has any announcement that they would like to make? Yes, Rita.
Well, of course, I just posted that the next coffee talk is coming up, and we're going to have a guest speaker that is going to talk about small business tech trip. I'm having a hard time talking. Small business tips for your financing and your bookkeeping. We're going to have a CPA, Megan Gerhardt, speaking. And for those of you that have never been to Coffee Talk, it's networking, relaxed conversation where you're going to learn something and meet new people.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other announcements?
I take it, Rita, that's an in-person thing.
Well, it has been for 16 years, except for the last year when it's been virtual. So it's still virtual.
Oh, I see. I was
It
talking to,
will go back to in-person in the next couple of months.
yeah, we're still months away from that here in Alberta. And Raj and I have been talking about this, comparing notes over the past few weeks. And it sounds like you guys are in just this utopic environment where everyone's free and running around without masks and hugging again. I mean, we're still miles away from that here in Alberta, but hoping to get back to that. The notion of having a coffee in person with a group of like-minded people is very alluring at this point. So I wish you well. And I have to go and take one of my kids to school myself. I want to thank you, Raj, first for bringing me into this, and everyone here for being so kind and accepting and open-minded. It's really been a treat. So, and best of luck to you in your pursuits. Have a wonderful and safe summer. And by all means, I did leave my email address if you don't want to participate on my quiz and receive my newsletters or anything like that. Feel free to shoot me an email as well. Be more than happy to carry on conversations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. We enjoyed having you. Have a great summer. And I'll be in touch. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Let's follow up.
Yeah.
Take care,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yeah.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Okay, folks, we are going to move to our networking session now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.